and could never imagine ever running a marathon. I stuck with track, found myself commonly injured. So when I couldn't run, I'd bike. When I couldn't bike, I'd swim. My first marathon was actually in an Ironman. Woke up one day and decided that was going to be a good idea. Can I actually continue to improve and reach new heights? VO2 testing and lactate testing and things of that sort, or even nutrition science has just like completely changed the game. So we were on a journey to complete the 6 world marathon majors. This in honor of our dad who passed away, and can't imagine running without a full sense of community.
.2, a podcast powered by Drip. Hello, everyone. Welcome to 26.2. My name is Karishma, and I'm the CEO and founder of Drip. And today I'm here with Rob Dalto, marathoner, community builder, etc., and ready to hear about his story. Thanks for being on, Rob.
Thanks for having me.
Awesome. Would love to hear like an intro about yourself, just general background, how you grew up, and where you're from.
Sure. Yeah, from Connecticut, grew up in the greater New York City area. So I've largely always been around the Northeast with the exception of a stint out in London. Post-college or post-undergrad, I moved to New York City, which is very common for people from the greater tri-state area. Did my graduate degree here at NYU. And I mean, just relevantly, just since high school was into running and all sorts of sports. And then after college, and particularly when I went to London, I got into endurance sport and marathoning. And since then went on a journey that we'll get into, but that's the short story of how we got here.
Gotcha. So many follow-ups based off of that. You said you got into like marathoning like when you were in London or just a little bit later into adult life. Were you involved in any capacity, like growing up, high school, and so forth? And what did that look like beforehand?
Yeah, I joined cross country team in high school. Just wanted a sport to play in the fall. Found it to be a really great community. Was really bad. Was barely ever cracking varsity and cross country or anything distance related in high school. I do remember working at the local running shoe store in high school, and we had a guy that worked there, and he was a marathoner, and he ran under 3 hours, and I would just laugh in awe of how ridiculous such a thing was, and could never imagine ever running a marathon. But fast forward a bunch of years, and I stuck with track in college. It was actually a pole vaulter, and then found myself commonly injured. So when I couldn't run, I'd bike. When I couldn't bike, I'd swim. Decided to do triathlon. And my first marathon was actually in an Ironman. Woke up one day and decided that was going to be a good idea. Not literally that day, but 9 months later, trained and did an Ironman. And then yeah, kind of caught the endurance bug from there. And when I moved to London, started running marathons kind of as a way to see cities, and wasn't out there breaking any speed records. But then kind of went on a journey there since.
That's awesome. Did you do this like by yourself, like even with like the Ironman that you signed up for in the first marathon you did, or did you think you had like a community of people that you started running with?
Yeah, it's really interesting. I was always a real solo athlete. I didn't find much community aspect in it after high school when I had a team around me. And that's completely changed. Now, when I think about running, I can't imagine running without a full sense of community, that surrounds us. And I get so much fulfillment from being surrounded by community. But for years, I trained on my own. And one thing I do love about endurance sports is one thing you're able to do is set your sights on an objective far down the road that you can't achieve today. But if
Yeah.
you do this process of steps, you can ultimately get to a place you aren't today. And I always love seeing that progress and then seeing that objective being met. So it's something I've always been attracted to in the sport. But now doing that surrounded by a big community has just been so much more meaningful. So it's kind of forever shifted my mindset on what it means to be a runner.
Yeah, and would love to kind of touch on that in a little bit too. Just like all the communities that you've built, like through launching on social media, and just like sharing your journey too. But I guess like pivoting over, like post London Marathon, I'm gonna assume that was like your first one. What happened after? Like, walk me through like the entire genesis on how you continued. Was it multiple a year? Was it one a year? What did cadence kind of look like for you?
So you'd think it was London, and that was
Oh,
actually my inspiration. But as
okay.
many as many a marathoner have found, it is basically impossible to get into the London Marathon.
Yeah.
And so they told me, "Thank you, but you and 300,000 of your closest friends will not be running against against your desires and hopes." So I actually signed up for Paris, and I ran the Paris Marathon, which is, I would argue, nearly at the caliber of any of the world marathon majors. It's really a high-end race and very large, nearly 50,000 participants. Going to have a big year coming up this year with the Olympics out there, which is super exciting. But started there, and yeah, while I was out there in Europe, I actually ended up running a couple international marathons. After Paris, I ran Reykjavik over in Iceland. I ran
Oh,
Stockholm, Rome, Athens, ran one on Sicily. Uh, yeah, so I kind of got around Europe a little bit and really enjoyed seeing cities that way.
yeah, it's the best way to see a city. I've only done one European race, and this was like in San Sebastian, Spain, when I was like doing my grad program. But it was like the best way to see it. You see locals that are out, they're like cheering you on in a different language. It's just so nice to be like affiliated or just kind of like a part of like that community that's out there too. Training is a whole other thing. How did you train? Or like, I guess, did you train in London while you were there, or did you train a bit like in some of the cities before you even did the race?
Well, for the races, I would just rock up and run up. Living in London is always so easy to get, you basically 2 hour flight anywhere from Spain to Italy from London. So you really just can cover a lot of ground out there. But yeah, training's been interesting because what we've known to be true about how to get the most out of ourselves has really evolved over time. There are certainly some base principles that are always true. You run more, you get faster, sure. And you do different types of periodization in your training and you get faster. But what I've learned most recently, just about how we can get so much more out of the data that's available now and the science that's out there, whether it be endurance science and understanding training zones through VO2 testing and lactate testing, things of that sort, or even nutrition science, has just like completely changed the game. So it's really fascinating to look at what I was doing versus what I'm doing now and just look at the massive changes you can see. With what's accessible to us now. It's really just incredible.
Yeah, would love to just like hear more about that too. When did like any of these like pivots like happen during training, things that you were looking at, things that you were testing and tracking too? Was there a certain kind of like phases of progression, or did all of this kind of happen recently in like the recent races that you've done?
Yeah, it was really all this year. So heading into this year, uh I was on a journey with my sister. We were on a journey to complete the 6 world marathon majors. We decided to do this in honor of our dad who passed away in 2019 of cancer. He always loved watching us race, and it just got him really excited. And when he was diagnosed with cancer, my sister came up with the idea to run all the majors in his honor, and we would take him along for the journey as long as he was able to join us, and then we'd finish it without him, and in his honor. And in 2019, when he passed, we ran Berlin together. We'd already done New York and Chicago. My dad actually had a ticket booked to like it was really meaningful for him. Like he literally had a ticket booked to Berlin. It was kind of like a mental finish line for him to give him something to kind of have hope for and fight for. And we ended up going out there just together as a family without him. But fast forward, we came into this year actually needing to complete Tokyo and London, and obviously things were delayed through the COVID years. And in the process of deciding to complete those two this year, I'd also qualified for Boston. I therefore qualified for Chicago. My friend, or I did 9+1, so I'm in for New York. And basically just looked at the calendar. I was like, well, you know what? Not many people run all 6 in a year, and it took us 8 years to get all 6 done. And this is kind of a potentially unique and cool opportunity to run all 6 majors in one calendar year. So I signed up for Berlin in January and said, you know what, let's have a go at this. And didn't really know what I was getting into. I'd never run six in a year. It's kind of ridiculous to run six big organized races. I mean, outside of the training and the tax on the bodies, it's a big commitment. And I didn't know what to expect. And unfortunately, I pulled up injured in the spring in a major way through Tokyo, Boston, and London. I was really banged up and I needed to take 2 months off running after London. And once I saw what was happening to my body, I realized I needed to completely rethink things and rethink how I trained if I was going to be successful. So that was really the turning point.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. So many thoughts on that. First of all, super incredible to hear just kind of like what drove this too. And I'm really sorry for like your loss. But it's awesome that you're able to kind of commemorate your dad throughout like the rest of your running journey as well. And then just kind of following up on that, I think I read the stat less than 11,000 people have done all six majors in a certain given time. So it's incredible that you guys are able to do that and that you did it again, like in one calendar year or two. But talk to me about like some of like the training. You said you kind of went through a lot of like phases of basically like optimizing like health throughout the process. What points did you kind of like have to take time off? What did you do to like optimize recovery? And how did you come back to basically hit like your best PR as well?
Yeah, so the whole second half of the year, I'll just focus on that because that's been the most transformational period of training in my 20 years of running. By it's not even a comparison. Yeah, I mean, from Tokyo, which was in March, to Boston mid-April, barely trained. Was didn't really know what was going on, but had a knee issue. Turned out I actually damaged the cartilage a little bit, which is not like a great thing over the long term. And then after London, needed to take 2 months off. So I had more time off this year than I've ever had in any year of running since I started. So I was feeling like I was down pretty bad, and I like wasn't sure how like anything could be possible. But through my friend Tyler Schwartz, who's the organizer of Endorphins, he connected me with Jonah Rosner, who's here in New York. He was just an absolute, I mean, literal scientist, um, but mad scientist, most talented endurance science coach I've ever met. And we got linked up and started talking. And I told him about what my goals were because I want to continue to get faster. I'm, just narrowly a sub 3 hour marathoner over the last couple of years. And we were, I've got a great data set of my training from the past, and we were like, hey, here's some things we can do, and let's see if we can set up a more sustained training program for you and do it in a way that can still get you to perform your best. And so we basically set out on a journey to see, can I actually continue to improve and reach new heights in overall performance in the marathon while reducing overall mileage? Can we train harder, or can we train smarter, not harder? And we had some really great data sets to use, some past training data, but we did VO2 testing. We did force plate analysis. We looked at foot pressure mapping for shoe selection and to understand some things about biomechanics. And without going too deep, we can go deeper, but the most interesting data point intersection was looking at the data from the VO2 max testing and then comparing that against what we were seeing in the force plate analysis, because it was basically giving us information for, hey, do I have like a strong base but need to work on my speed in the most basic sense? And then comparing that against like what physiologically are my strengths or weaknesses? Do I have good springiness? Do I have explosiveness? What of that needs to be adapted to reach marathon performance? And you could basically triangulate these data points and understand where you need to improve your performance. And what jumped out was, hey, there's actually a really good path here to being able to achieve what I want to achieve. And we put together a plan that essentially focused on really high quality running, a lot of lower zone work using cross training like elliptical and cycling, and then really prescriptive strength training, which I've come to learn for running is way different than we've really conventionally learned over the years. We learn a lot of um like plyometrics, but plyometrics in like like kind of lighter weight lunges, just like all this stuff. The reality is explosive movements are actually what can drive the best adaptations for you neuromuscularly. And you can do that without adding fatigue that's going to slow down your running, but help build that muscle strength, tendon elasticity. And so we put that plan in place, and in just over 2 months of working together, ended up setting a lifetime best in the marathon at Chicago this fall.
That's insane. So yeah, so many thoughts on that too, but like that's insane that you were able to do that. Reducing mileage and kind of like really honing in on very, very specific and concrete data points as it relates to different like mechanics too. When you mentioned like VO2 testing, can you talk about accessibility? This wasn't available about 30, 40 years ago. What would you say to like the average person who's maybe run a couple races, wants to hit a PR, or someone who's just starting? Where can they go and kind of incorporate these elements into their own training?
Yeah, I mean, when it comes to VO2 testing, like I don't even know if it existed 30, 40 years ago. I mean, even 5 years ago, I never imagined that was something that a average recreational runner could even have access to. It was always something, it
Yeah.
was like a fable. It's like, oh yeah, like the top 1% of professionals might be able to get a VO2 test in a lab. I mean, it was something I just never thought uh, was accessible. So what I'd say about it is, one, and I'm seeing like labs pop up all over the place. So I mean, depending on who you're working with, like it's accessible. It's not necessarily like the cheapest thing in the world,
Yeah.
but what you can do using either that or other testing through devices that we have, like smartwatches and other, to give yourself a sense of where your zones are. You can use this data to be so much more precise in your training. And I've realized that that's everything. Like recently, there's a lot of trends people talk about, oh, like 80-20 rule, 80% slow, 20% fast. You know, the year of zone two running and then understanding what your thresholds are.
Yeah.
If you lean in and take the time to understand and learn kind of where you're at, you can really put together a plan that doesn't require you to run more, but can amplify your performance by material number of percentage points and get faster. So what I would say is, whether it's the technology or even just the access to data, can be game changing for anyone. Whether you want to go in and can spend the money to do that, or use the tools that we have in a more simple sense to get a high level of accuracy and information that you can put to use.
Yeah. Talk to me about like fuel, because a lot of this is really looking at output and like energy that you're exerting in terms of performance. How did this relate to like how you were fueling pre-race, so during training and then during race, and then even like during recovery as well?
Yeah, it's fueling is such a critical component. I would always re consider fueling to be the easiest lever to pull to increase performance, because
Mhm.
it's right there for you. It doesn't take more time. You don't have to train harder to get gains with fueling. It's literally just consuming things.
Yeah.
It's not making extra time to sleep. It's just knowing what to take and what you can use to just maximize your efficiency and your output when you're running. I've learned a couple of things here this year. I've always been one to lean into consuming high quantities of food when it comes to any sort of endurance event. Before a race, I'm gonna have the biggest breakfast you're ever gonna see. And I'd always be bewildered by friends who'd be like, "Oh yeah, no, I'm gonna show up and run. I'll have a banana before the race." I'm like, "Really? That's it?" Like, oh man, I don't know about that. So I've always been one that leaned into really trying to maximize fueling intake. A couple of things that I saw this year, just in observation of the running community, I spent a lot of time with a lot of newer runners this year who were running their first few marathons. I think that the industry really does runners a disservice who are trying to learn about the sport as they go
Yeah.
from a fueling perspective. There are a lot of, like, if you look at gels, so typically what I find is there's two dimensions to like endurance sport, like while working out. There's your like carbohydrate fuel, and then there's like your electrolyte fuel. First, people tend to learn about the carbohydrates, like gels or other fueling sources similar that are going to give them calories and carbohydrates.
Yeah.
A lot of the brands will recommend really conservative numbers to consume, because a lot of folks will have GI distress like the first time that they're testing out like or using gels.
Yeah.
So you look at like the back of a goo, it's like, yeah, have a goo, take one every like 30 or 45 minutes. There's only 21 grams of carbohydrate in one of those goos. So it's basically recommending like 30, 40 grams an hour max. Whereas the science says you could take 100 grams an hour to maximize your output. So one thing I did this year, I was already kind of in the 60 to 80 range. I pushed and you should train this. You should,
Yeah.
practice what you're going to do on race day, of course. But I'd make my own gels and I would take 90 grams an hour in all my races this year. And so I really put that strategy to the test. And I noticed that in Chicago, even running a personal best, when I
Mhm.
finished the race, I had my last gel like 15 or 18 minutes before I finished. I've never finished a race with so much energy because I knew I was just fueling the tank all the way right through.
Yeah.
Whereas I know a lot of times folks will kind of take the minimum and then they'll do it so that they finish on empty. Like they need a gel, but they just don't want to stomach it, and they finish and they're exhausted, they're bonked, they're flushed, and that doesn't help recovery either when you're that drained when you finish.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, that was literally like my first race that you described, like completely empty, like couldn't walk for a week. I think I like had to call in for work like that Monday. And so forth. So it makes like a huge difference. Outside of like fueling, like during training, and like during race, like is there any sort of like diet like you integrated like into your training regimen too? Or is it like anything goes while you're pre-race?
I've sort of found you don't do yourself any service by overthinking it.
Yeah,
Sure, eat clean, eat simple, eat more carbs, but I don't overthink it. I found sometimes I could get too caught up in some details and that mental energy that I'd exert on something that was going to give a very nominal gain in performance, probably cost me more in mental energy in the end. So I don't overthink it. Basic principles apply,
yeah,
and just try to stay loose.
got it. Cool. Shifting gears now, going back to the community that you built. Incredible what you've like built, like even on social media, all the groups that you're a part of. What sparked this? Like, why in 2023 did you decide to kind of like start documenting like this journey? Who have you met like throughout the process, and what kind of like doors does this open up into building community? And what does that look like? It's like 5 questions, so I'll stop right there.
There's a lot there. Yeah. So in January, once I signed up and decided I was going to do all six of the World Marathon majors, I downloaded TikTok, started an account, and decided I'd chronicle the journey. And I had no idea what that would turn into. I just figured I'd talk about what I was doing. And going out to Tokyo, I got linked up with Tyler Schwartz, who's the organizer of Endorphins, and he was getting that run club off the ground. And I went to the shakeout run that he organized with Endorphins out in Tokyo, and I met so many incredible people. I just had this like whole wave of inspiration that came my way. In my mind, I was like, "Oh, I'm running 6 marathons this year. It's kind of cool. I'm excited about it." And everyone I turned to was doing something just radically incredible. And it made me really curious to learn about other people's stories and just meet all these people who are just like you and me. They're not full-time professional athletes, but they're doing really incredible things, either personally, physically, or doing things for a purpose way bigger than themselves. And it just kind of lit this fire in my soul, I'll say, to explore that. And then fast forward to Boston, I was injured going into the race, and I was literally thinking before the race, like, should I even do this? Why am I doing this? Like,
Mm.
I'm going kind of against my own principles. Like, why would I run a race when I'm injured? Like, this is ridiculous. And I decided if I'm going to do it, I'm going to like have the like the craziest day ever. And I went out and had the time of my life. I did all the side quests. So basically unhinged, running around Boston for 4 hours. I stopped at Dunkin' Donuts.
Oh my gosh.
I stopped at the local gym. I stopped at my friend's house. Um, just talking to people that were there supporting the race. It was just like a wild day. And a couple of my videos that I posted that day kind of went viral on TikTok. Like several videos of like 500,000 views or more than that. And that was my first kind of launch into real social media. But a couple days later, I had to turn around and fly out to London for the London Marathon. And the London Marathon was really the culmination of my initial journey with my sister in honor of our dad. And a bunch of people had just seen this guy who probably seemed really funny. He's unhinged, running around Boston, and there were some eyeballs there, and then they saw like a very different side of me, which was like a much more vulnerable, like, hey, like this is like an incredibly emotional week. It's one I've been looking forward to for years, to honor our dad, and the whole family's flying out. I knew I'd be. It's gonna be a day where I was gonna be crying. My sister and I were gonna run the whole race together. Families flew out there for it. And I just kind of put that very vulnerably out to the world. And I was just so blown away by like the energy that came back to me. The number of people that reached out that had like their own story of grief or having lost a parent. And particularly in London, they do an incredible job of running for charity. So hard to get in there in the lottery. There's so many spots allocated for charities. There's so many people out there doing incredible work for a purpose that means a lot to them. And it just took what I kind of that little fire that I got under me from Tokyo and like threw gas on it, like just so much bigger. Um, and I just couldn't help but to continue leaning into like the community, the amazing people, um, in a really vulnerable and like open way. And so that's kind of what I started doing for the rest of the year after that.
That's incredible. I was gonna ask as a follow-up, what was like your most memorable moment from all the races this year? Was it that or
Oh gosh, there's so many. There's honestly a lot of moments that are deeply meaningful that like wouldn't make sense to anyone unless you were there. Like meaningful moments for people other than myself that I just know meant a ton to them. People when they see friends or family or just in their own deep moments. So
yeah.
a lot of the moments that like meant the most, if I explained them all, you'd be like, dude, I don't get it. There were like a lot of you had to be there, feeling type moments. But along the way, I've been blessed to meet some really incredible and inspiring people who are just like doing really game-changing things in the world. I mean, aside from Tyler and Jonah, I'm really close to here in New York that I mentioned, become really good friends with Thomas Eller, who's from Germany, is the first deaf-born runner to do all six of the world marathon majors, and he's just made a huge impact on the deaf community and also just inclusion in the sport, and just showing folks that they can push their limits in terms of what they can do from that community. As well as my buddy Simone from Italy. He's the fastest type 1 diabetic runner
Oh, yeah.
to complete all the world majors, and just showing that community, a very big community, what's possible, and kind of going against the odds and the challenges that you face and the variables that you face as a diabetic athlete to achieve your best. So yeah, those are just the two of many many incredible examples.
Yeah, I love that so much. I often like think back to like this one quote that one of my friends has said is like the running community is like divided into like two different categories. People run because it's something they absolutely love and can't imagine like their life without it. Or they run because it saved them from something, and that can mean like anything whatsoever. So I always love like hearing stories about that of people that have overcome something or kind of like set the bar in a very different level, like for themselves, and just like something that's larger than that too.
Yeah,
Yeah.
totally.
What's next? What's like your moonshot? I guess like one, what's next for 2024? And then what's the moonshot?
Yeah, a couple things. I mean, one thing that's really inspired me this year is just having an impact on the community. I don't think this journey needs to be about me. I get much more satisfaction out of it being about others and helping them, bring light to their stories and their journeys and the impact that they're making on the world. So, I mean, personally, like here in New York, I've started a nonprofit with my friend Shaq, Bronx Burners Run Club up in the Bronx. And so it's really, really meaningful for us to lean into community and opportunity up there. So we've got a great crew. We're not nonprofit run club, and we'll give back to the community. Looking to give out a bunch of scholarships to our student athletes up there. And more broadly, I'll still be running. So when it
Yeah.
comes to finding incredible people and getting their stories out there, I don't think there's a better venue for that than the World Marathon Majors. So you'll find me out there at a bunch of those. I'm still finalizing the calendar for next year, but you'll see me at a bunch of those and also Sydney Marathon in 2024.
That's awesome. Yeah, I think it's gonna be an unofficial seventh major. I don't know. They're talking about it.
They've got one more year where they need to achieve all the required protocols, and if they do that successfully, they would be accepted as the seventh.
That's insane. That's awesome. Well, thanks so much. This was so much fun.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me.
Yeah. Learn more about Drip at dripco.us and follow us on Instagram at dripwearable. We'll be back soon with a brand new episode.